Well, my name's been used a lot around these parts over the years. I'm Frank Clark of the Ward Clark Sheep Company, and I'm the man who trapped and eventually killed what was reportedly the largest grizzly bear ever taken in these 48 states. His name was Old Ephraim, and I thought I'd try my hand at telling his story to you. Now, I ain't too good at verbalizing because, well, sheep herders don't get too much practice, but I'll give it a try. Now, let me start off by telling you that there's some folks what believes that Eve had his first encounter with man when he was just a cub. There's a true story about the Slough Grizzly of Fort Mendon. She was a mother grizz with 2 cubs, and they was a wintering over at Fort Mendon on the west side of Cache Valley. She had dug a den into the bank of a frozen slough and was a-trying to mind her own business, but you know how mother bears is when they got cubs to protect. She bears is the most ferocious animals in the wild when it comes to protecting their young, and the most ferocious of all bears is the grizz. Ursus horribilis, as the books calls him. Now, the Fort Mendon blacksmith was the biggest, most powerful man in town, and he was low on firewood, so him and his son-in-law was out on the frozen slough one foggy, cold winter day looking for firewood. They went separate directions, and as this blacksmith rounded a corner, he come face to face with that she-grizz looming up out of the fog. Well, without thinking, he took a swing at her with his axe, but she just swatted it out of his hand like a matchstick, and then she lurched forward and pounced on him before he could even move. She took his head clean off his shoulders for him, and she scattered pieces of him all over. Well, the blacksmith's son-in-law got to wondering what was a keeping his pappy-in-law so long, so he doubled back looking for him. Well, he come upon no horrible sight, that man all torn to pieces, with his head a-laying across the ice, and he went a-screaming back into town and got a hunting party up. Well, the men trailed that mother grizz back to her den, and they spooked her out and they killed her, but not before she'd put up quite a battle. And then they spooked her 2 cubs out of the den, and the cubs tried to get away over the ice, but gunfire erupted like thunder, and the air was filled with hot lead. They dropped the one deader'n a doornail, but the other one jumped into the icy water and swam to the other side with bullets a-zinging all around him. They think they injured his paw 'cause they seen him jump, and they found some blood, but the cub, well, he got away. Well, that was in the late 1800s. Several years later, sheep herders in the mountains east of Cache Valley across the valley started reporting their sheep being killed by a huge grizzly with only 3 toes on one paw. Now, I ain't going to tell you that cub grew up to be Old Ephraim, but there's some who believes it to be so. Old Ephraim's tracks was easy to spot. They was huge, plus one paw only had 3 toes on it. 3 Toes was his name long before Old Ephraim. Old Ephraim was the name of a bear in a book about some settlers in California what was being terrorized by a huge grizzly. Well, somebody in Logan Canyon must have read the book and changed the name of their bear from 3 Toes to Old Ephraim. Now, Old Ephraim stood 9 foot 11 inches tall. Now, I'm told that the boys and girls likes to play basketball, and a basketball hoop is 10 foot off the ground. Eve could walk under a basketball hoop and just brush the fur on the top of his head. He weighed 1,100 pounds. That's a lot of grizz. His hide weighed 200 pounds. It was an inch thick, too. Hey, how thick is your hide? Why, shoot, it's about as thick as a piece of paper. Now, Eve's skull, without any hide nor hair on it, filled a bushel basket. Eve ranged all the way from Soda Springs, Idaho in the north, down to Weber Canyon down above Ogden, Utah in the south, But for the last 10 or 12 years of his life, he stayed pretty much to the right-hand fork of Logan Canyon here in the Cache Valley. Now, when I come to the right-hand fork to herd sheep in 1911, it was considered by most to be the most bear-infested area in the state. Brown and black bears was everywhere, and they was killing lots of our sheep. Let me tell you how most bears kill sheep and cattle. They goes in the middle of the herd in the night while the herd's a-dozing and runs through a-swatting the critters on the back, which breaks their back. Now, that don't usually kill the animal, just keeps them from running away. And then the bear comes back and rolls one of those poor suffering creatures over and just eats the tender parts, the brisket and the udder. And then that usually don't kill the sheep neither. Then the bear moseys over to another sheep and rolls it over and does the same with it. I tell you, one morning I had to go out with my rifle and put 23 sheep out of their misery. 1 year, I lost 154 sheep to bears. Oh, I swore vengeance on bears, and vengeance was mine. I killed 43 bears in 34 years up there. We ate a lot of bear meat, which ain't bad eating if you don't get a good look at it before you skins it. Now, I always thought it peculiar that as big as Old Ephraim was, only 2 or 3 men ever seen him. In 1913, my friend Sam Kemp was walking up the trail with his rifle. He rounded the curve and found himself face to face with Eph. Eph went up on his hind legs, and pretty quick Sam found himself looking straight up at 9 foot 11 inches of grizzly bear. He told me later, "Frank, I wanted to raise my gun and shoot him, but I was paralyzed with fear and I couldn't do it. All I could do was start backing away slow." Probably saved his life. When Sam started backing up, old Eph, he just come back down on all fours and turned around and went the other way. I always wanted to ask old Sam if when he got back to camp he had to change his drawers. Well, that same year, I happened upon Eph's wallow, about a mile above my camp. Now, a wallow is your bear's bathtub in hot weather. They digs it out of the ground and siphons creek water into it. This wallow had Eph's prints all around it, and it was 15 foot in diameter and was over 2 foot deep. And I decided then and there to try to trap him. I went down and I got a 23-pound bear trap, the biggest I could get. Now, people ask me, "Frank, how powerful was that trap?" Well, I once stuck a solid piece of 2x4 into a 23-pound bear trap, and it snapped it in two like a toothpick, quicker'n you could say Bob's your uncle. I opened the trap up with clamps, and I slid it down under the water. The trap was attached to a 14-foot-long chain. The chain was attached by a ring to a timber chain that was wrapped around a 9-foot log that was 12 inches in diameter. Now, people says, "Frank, why the log? Why not a tree?" That's 'cause if a bear thinks it can't get away, it'll chaw its paw off and get away on 3. So's you wants to anchor the trap to a log so's you can drag it around a bit. Well, when I come back to check the trap, it was a-sitting up on the side of the wallow. It hadn't even been tripped shut. Now, that's a pretty soft touch for a bear. So I put the trap back into the water, and Eph come along later and pulled it back out and took his bath and went away. Well, I tell you, these cat and mouse games went on for 10 years, and never once did he trip that trap shut. But then, on the morning of August 20th, 1923, I found that Eph had got spooked over something and dug himself a new wallow. Just below the old one. He siphoned the water out of the old one into the new one, and he took his bath and he went his way. So I really went into the details, and I slipped the trap under the water of the new wallow, and I got a stick, and I stirred the mud in the bottom up onto the trap so's it couldn't be seen, and I looked and I squinted and I couldn't see that trap no way. And then I camouflaged the chain by brushing dirt and leaves over it. I covered the log with branches, and then I used a branch to sweep away all my footprints. I figured I'd done all I could, so I went back down to camp and I went about my business. That night was clear and dark. No moon, but lots of stars. I sat outside my tent smoking my pipe until about 10. I had all the chores done. All the critters was fed. It was so quiet that I could hear the bell around one of the horses' neck down in the meadow below camp. My little dog, Jenny, was curled up in the tent asleep. Pretty soon, so was I. Well, I figure it was about 4 hours later that I got woke up by the most hellacious racket I'd ever heard. It was echoing off the mountains, and it was hard to tell where it was a-coming from at first. Finally, I realized it was coming from up above camp. Now, at first, I thought it might have been a horse down. A horse will make a noise kind of like that when it's in trouble. What I didn't know was that it was Eph. He had got careless and put his right front paw smack in the middle of that 23-pound trap, and the metal teeth went a-crunching into his flesh. He let out a beller of pain and surprise and took off a-running. But then he come to the end of the chain, and the trap bit into his paw even deeper, and he really howled. Well, that whole area was soon turned into one of complete devastation. Logan Canyon ain't never seen fury like that. All of the trees within the 28-foot circle that chain would let Eve travel was cut or knocked down by old Ephraim's fury. 6-inch diameter quaking aspens was taken down in one blow. Why, I seen one quakey that had been snapped off in one savage chomp, 9 foot, 11 inches off the ground by my measure. Well, then Eve apparently followed the chain back to the log it was fastened to, 'cause when I found it later, it had been chawed through over and over again until it was laying in 2 and 3 foot sections. But that weren't good enough. Well, then he went to work on that 5-inch diameter ring made out of 1/4-inch steel that attached the 14-foot chain in the trap to the timber chain that was wrapped around the log. He bit and he tore and he yanked until that ring was in 2 pieces. He broke off a couple of his teeth and he bloodied up his mouth something awful, but he was finally free of that log. He wound that chain around his foreleg just as neat as if a man had done it for him, and then he started down the creek bed. Now, the fact that he went downhill toward my camp instead of uphill indicated to me that he knew whose trap was bit down on his paw, and he wanted to settle the score. Now, remember, I still thought it was a horse down. So I threw on my shoes. I didn't bother putting on my pants and a shirt. Who was I going to see 20 miles up above Logan? I told my little dog to stay there, and I grabbed my .25-35 rifle that I always keep loaded with 7 steel ball cartridges, and I started up the trail. It was pitch black and plenty cold for BVDs, I'll tell you that. I got about 400 yards up the trail, and I stopped to give a listen. And that's when I heard it. The moaning and the chain on the trap are rattling. That is when I first realized old Ephraim was in the trap. But then I realized something else. The noise was coming from behind me. I had passed within 10 foot of old Ephraim in the dark, and now he was between me and my camp. Well, what was I going to do now? I couldn't get around him to get back down to camp. It was too dark. I might run into him. So I decided to wait until sunup. I crawled up onto the side hill a few feet and just kind of hunkered down there for the night. I was a-shivering plenty. And I don't mind telling you that it wasn't all because of the cold. I sat there all night listening to Eph moaning and tearing at that trap. I'll tell you, no Indian ever went on the attack with more joy than I did when it finally come dawn. Well, Eph was pretty well hidden in the creek bottom by dawn, so I threw sticks in to scare him out. He slipped out, and he crashed his way down through the brush. I tracked him all the way down to by my tent. He was in some tall willows down there in the wash. I could just see a patch of fur, so I drew down and I squeezed off a shot. It grazed his shoulder. And now for the greatest thrill of my life. Eph stood up on his hind legs with his back to me. It's the first time I'd seen that bear. He could have gone straight ahead and tried to get away, but he didn't. He turned to face me, and he come a-waddling towards me with that trap on his paw. Both paws raised up over his head. He got closer and closer. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't raise my gun until he was about 6 foot away. Finally, I come to my senses, and I stuck out the gun and I pulled the trigger. He took the bullet in the chest and the blood just flew. He fell back a step, but then here he come again. So I fired again, and again, and again, and again. He had taken 6 bullets at close range and was a-spurting blood out of his chest and his mouth, but he still kept a-coming. He would not go down, and I had just 1 bullet left. Well, there was a 4-foot bank that he had to surmount before he could get to me. It stopped him for a second, and then he turned, and he started to waddle up the wash. I figured he'd had enough. But then I realized that he was just moving up onto the trail so's he could get to me. And here he come. He was hurt bad, too, but he was faster than me, so I took off down that trail with that grizzly closing in on me, with blood spurting from his chest and his mouth and his nose. I tell you, things wasn't looking too good. And as I rounded a curve, I heard a beautiful sound. My dog Jenny had come out of the tent and was barking at Eve's heels. This made him stop for a second. Bears hate dogs, and they'll try to kill him. Well, while Eve was trying to swat the dog, I ran towards him, trying to find a kill spot for my last bullet. But he seen me coming, and he turned around after me again. So off I came down the trail again, hollered, "Sig him, Jenny! Sig him! Get him! Go on, get him!" Well, when Eve turned to swat that dog again, I said a prayer, and I raced up as close as I dared, and I put my last shot into the side of his head. Eve hit the ground like an earthquake. And when he went down, I felt kind of lightheaded, and my knees buckled, and I went down too. And for the longest time, I just knelt there next to Eve, watching the life slowly fading out of him. I think I was sorry. He was one of nature's most magnificent creatures. In my mind, he was the most magnificent creature. But he was killing my sheep, and I had to do it. Well, finally, Eve rolled his head around a bit, and he picked it up off the ground ever so slightly, and he looked me right in the eye. And then he dropped his head. And it was finally over. I was shaking pretty bad. In fact, I was still shaking several days afterward, and that's the truth. When I got my strength back, I was craving human company for a change. I was able to locate one of the horses that had been knocked down into the wash by the other horses in their panic to escape from the bear. She was hobbled up and couldn't get up. So I freed her and saddled her up and rode 4 miles over to the sheep camp of my friend Joe Brown. I told him the story, and I rested a spell, and then Joe come back with me to where Eve lay. We skinned him and strung his 200-pound hide on a rope between 2 quakies. We tied onto our saddles with ropes to pull Eve's body away from the camp and the water supply. but 2 straining horses couldn't budge that huge carcass. So what I done is I burned him, and I burned him, and I burned him. For 3 days I burned that bear. Then I buried the skull and the bones. Well, word traveled fast. The scoutmaster of the Boy Scouts in Logan, Dr. George Hill, wrote to the Smithsonian Institute and told them, we've taken what we think is a very large grizzly bear in Logan Canyon. Well, the Smithsonian wrote back and they said, there ain't any grizz in Logan Canyon. Used to be many years ago, but they's all gone. But if you'll send us the skull, we'll examine it and tell you what it is. So them scouts, they hiked up to Old Ephraim's grave, and they dug up his skull, and they cleaned it up, and they sent it off to Washington, D.C., and pretty quick, here come a letter back saying that not only was it a grizzly skull, it was from the largest grizz ever taken in these here 48 states. And enclosed was a check for $25. They had kept the skull to put on display back there in their museum. Well, folks, thank you for listening. I guess them's just about all the facts about how I killed the king of the grizzlies in my BVDs.